Put the ring back on her finger. The command exploded across the grand ballroom, and instantly, nearly 300 of the most powerful figures in America's underworld went silent. Every single eye turned to Matteo Falcone, the untouchable mafia boss who had never lost a negotiation, never once hesitated, and certainly had never, in his life, been humiliated in public. And yet, there he stood, frozen. Across from Matteo was Amelia Rhodes, a cheerful, plus-size piano teacher who'd been hired that night simply to provide elegant background music. Calmly, without a trace of panic, Amelia slipped the diamond ring off her finger. She placed it gently back into Matteo's stunned hand and gave him a warm smile, a smile that held no fear and no excitement either. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," Amelia said softly. "Congratulations to the real bride." A ripple of laughter spread through the rival mafia families. Isabella Moro's face twisted with rage as she demanded that security remove the embarrassing woman immediately. Without another word, Amelia picked up her sheet music and turned toward the exit, fully convinced the awkward misunderstanding was over. Then Matteo's deep voice stopped the entire room. "Everyone stays exactly where they are." He looked past the politicians, past the mafia dons, past the woman he was supposed to marry. And then, for the first time in his life, the most feared man in America walked away from power itself to chase the only woman who had ever handed his ring back. The crystal chandeliers inside the Astoria Grand Ballroom shimmered like frozen constellations, casting warm light across the polished marble floors and tables dressed with white orchids flown in from Singapore only hours before. Every detail had been planned with military precision. Politicians traded quiet smiles with corporate magnates. International investors whispered beside aging mafia dons, men whose names rarely appeared in newspapers, but who quietly pulled strings behind governments from the shadows. Tonight was supposed to celebrate certainty. The engagement of Matteo Falcone and Isabella Moro would unite two powerful dynasties, strengthening alliances that stretched across North America and Europe. Every guest in that room understood exactly what this announcement meant politically. Every camera had already been positioned before the first toast was even raised. Only one person in the entire ballroom had absolutely no idea what kind of evening she'd just walked into. Amelia Rhodes sat alone beside the polished Steinway grand piano near the ballroom's towering windows. She flexed her fingers gently, smiling as she tested a few quiet chords while guests continued filing in. Music had always calmed her before performances, not because she feared mistakes, but because she wanted every note to disappear into the air, invisible. If people remembered the music instead of the musician, Amelia considered the night a success. She adjusted the silver ribbon holding back her chestnut hair and glanced toward the banquet tables. Luxury gowns, tailored tuxedos, diamond necklaces worth more than her entire apartment. It felt like another universe entirely. Amelia had only taken this gig because the hotel manager explained the charity committee needed a last-minute pianist after their original performer fell ill. The payment would help replace several aging pianos back at her community music school. That mattered far more to Amelia than any guest list ever could. As conversations filled the ballroom, Amelia began quietly playing Debussy's Clair de Lune. Within moments, the entire atmosphere softened. Even hardened businessmen unconsciously slowed their conversations. Several elderly guests closed their eyes. Children from the diplomatic families wandered closer to the piano, mesmerized by the gentle melody. Amelia noticed them smiling. That was enough for her. Across the ballroom, Matteo Falcone entered through the main doors, flanked by discreet security dressed like ordinary executives. The room transformed instantly. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Veteran mafia leaders nodded respectfully. Government officials straightened their posture. No formal announcement was necessary. Matteo's presence alone changed the air in the room. At 47, Matteo carried the calm confidence of a man used to absolute control. His charcoal suit fit flawlessly, and every measured step reflected decades of discipline, not arrogance. He acknowledged greetings with polite nods while his sharp eyes quietly swept the room, including, for one brief second, the pianist. She seemed completely unaware that the most powerful man in the room had just walked in. She didn't stop playing. She didn't even glance up. She simply kept helping a frightened little boy standing near the piano smile through the music. Matteo found that oddly refreshing. Most people noticed him before they noticed themselves. This woman noticed the child instead. Before he could think further on it, Victor Salazar approached, carrying a folder. "Everything's prepared," Victor said quietly. "Press is in position. The families are waiting. Isabella's ready for the announcement." Matteo gave a short nod. He'd never particularly enjoyed public spectacles, but alliances demanded ceremony. If one evening of appearances could prevent years of unnecessary conflict, it was a reasonable price to pay. Across the room, Isabella Moro admired herself in a mirrored column. Her emerald gown drew admiring glances from nearly everyone in the room. Everything was unfolding exactly as she'd imagined. In minutes, she would officially become the future Mrs. Matteo Falcone. Power, influence, respect, everything her family had chased for generations. She barely registered the piano music. To her, it was just elegant background decoration. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conversations faded. "It is my great honor to invite Mr. Matteo Falcone to the stage for a historic announcement." Polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Matteo walked forward. Victor discreetly pressed a velvet ring box into his hand. Everything was following the carefully rehearsed schedule, except for one tiny detail. While photographers adjusted their angles, hotel staff hurriedly rearranged decorations near the stage. One employee accidentally bumped into Isabella, knocking her several steps sideways, right as Amelia finished the final movement of her performance. The applause for the music blended seamlessly with the applause welcoming Matteo. Believing her performance had ended, Amelia stood, bowed politely, and stepped toward the nearest exit, sheet music in hand. Unfortunately, that path crossed directly in front of the stage. Victor noticed too late. A photographer shouted, "Move closer." Another waved toward Matteo. The confused stage coordinator pointed at Amelia, assuming she was part of the ceremony, because under the ballroom lights, her elegant navy blue dress looked strikingly close in color to Isabella's gown. For one impossible moment, everyone misread everyone else. Matteo turned just as Amelia stopped beside the stage, trying not to interrupt the celebration. Victor whispered urgently, "Now." Following the rehearsal exactly, Matteo opened the velvet box without really looking at the woman in front of him. He gently reached for her left hand. The ballroom erupted in applause. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. Amelia blinked. She looked down. A breathtaking diamond ring now rested on her finger. For a moment, her mind went completely silent. Then realization hit. "Oh." She glanced past Matteo and finally spotted Isabella standing several feet away, and the look on Isabella's face told her everything she needed to know. Amelia almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the whole thing was simply too unbelievable to be real. She looked back at Matteo. His confident expression had already started to shift. For the first time, he was truly looking at the woman whose hand he was holding. 3 endless seconds passed. Then Amelia smiled, with genuine kindness. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, just quiet enough that only those nearby could hear. Without hesitation, without drama, without trying to milk the moment, Amelia carefully slid the ring off, placed it back into Matteo's hand, folded his fingers around it, and gave a tiny apologetic bow. "I hope your evening becomes a lot less complicated." She turned to leave. The ballroom stayed dead silent, until someone laughed. Then another. Then whispers rippled through every table. Asterisk, the Mafia boss got rejected. "Did you see that?" She gave the ring back. "Nobody does that." Asterisk. Cameras flashed faster than ever. Journalists abandoned their prepared headlines on the spot. Across the room, Isabella's humiliation instantly curdled into fury. "Remove her," she shouted. "Security, get that ridiculous woman out of here." Amelia stopped walking. She turned just long enough to offer a polite smile. "There's no need. I was already leaving." She hugged her sheet music to her chest and headed for the ballroom doors, fully convinced she'd accidentally stumbled into the most important night of 2 total strangers' lives. Behind her, Matteo Falcone stood staring at the engagement ring resting in his open palm. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, He wasn't thinking about the woman he was supposed to marry. He was thinking about the woman who had just walked away without asking for his name, his fortune, or a second chance. The headlines exploded before sunrise. Asterisk Mafia boss rejected at his own engagement. Unknown piano teacher returns billion-dollar ring. The woman who walked away from Matteo Falcone. Asterisk. Television panels debated whether the whole thing had been an elaborate publicity stunt. Gossip columns insisted Amelia Rhodes had planned it to grab instant fame. Political analysts speculated the broken engagement would destabilize long-standing alliances. Amelia saw none of it, until one of her elderly piano students walked into class carrying a newspaper folded under his arm. "Miss Rhodes," Harold asked gently, "is this really you?" She looked down and nearly choked on her coffee. There she was, a single photograph, frozen at the exact moment she placed the ring back into Matteo's hand. Unfortunately, the picture made the whole thing look far more dramatic than she remembered it. The headlines certainly didn't help. She sighed. "I knew I should have taken the side hallway." Harold chuckled. "I don't think the hallway would have changed history." The classroom burst into laughter. Within minutes, the kids had completely forgotten about the newspaper. A 7-year-old proudly raised her hand. "Miss Amelia?" "Yes, Sophie." "Can we play the pirate song today?" Amelia smiled. "Only if everyone remembers their scales first." Instantly, the room filled with exaggerated groans. Normal life resumed, exactly the way Amelia liked it. Across the city, normal life had become impossible. Inside Falcone headquarters, dozens of executives avoided eye contact with Matteo as they filed quietly into the morning strategy meeting. Nobody mentioned the engagement. Nobody mentioned the newspapers. Nobody dared bring up the photograph that had already become the most shared image on social media. Matteo sat at the head of the conference table, reading financial reports as if nothing unusual had happened. Finally, Victor Salazar broke the silence. "The families are requesting another announcement. They'll wait. The press is demanding clarification. They'll wait. Isabella's father will also wait." Victor hesitated. "This misunderstanding has created complications." Matteo closed the folder. "No." The room went completely still. It exposed them. Victor frowned. The people who applauded before knowing whether anyone involved was actually happy. No one answered. After a long pause, Matteo stood. "I'll handle the situation myself." The executives assumed he meant another political meeting. Instead, 1 hour later, 3 black luxury SUVs quietly pulled up outside the Rhodes Community Music Center. The neighborhood couldn't have looked more different from Matteo's usual world. Small cafes, secondhand bookstores, kids riding bikes down the sidewalk, a florist arranging fresh flowers outside her shop. Simple. Peaceful. Real. His bodyguards looked distinctly uncomfortable. One leaned toward another. "Boss, are we expecting trouble?" Matteo studied the colorful mural painted across the music school's front wall. Children of every age playing instruments together. Inside, Amelia was helping a middle-aged firefighter find middle C for what had to be the 20th time. "No." She smiled patiently. "That's an E." "I knew that." "You confidently knew that." The class laughed. The firefighter rubbed the back of his neck. "They all look the same." "They absolutely do not." "They do if you're terrified." Before Amelia could respond, the classroom door swung open. Conversation stopped cold. 6 bodyguards entered first, and then Matteo Falcone. The children stared. The adults stared harder. One little boy whispered, far louder than he meant to, "Is he a movie star?" Another answered, "No. My dad says he's scary." Matteo almost smiled. Almost. Amelia blinked twice. "Oh, hello." She sounded genuinely surprised. Not frightened. Not impressed. Just surprised. "What brings you here?" "I'd like piano lessons." Silence. Several students glanced at each other. Then everyone burst out laughing, even Amelia. "I'm serious." "So am I." She folded her arms. "Do you own a piano?" "No." "Have you ever played one?" "No." "Can you read music?" "No." She nodded thoughtfully. Excellent. Mateo looked confused. I've never had a beginner who already looked this professional. The room laughed again. One child even clapped. Amelia walked to the registration desk and handed Mateo a clipboard. Fill this out. He took it, then paused. There are quite a lot of questions. Yes. They're asking for emergency contacts. Yes. My occupation? Yes. My goals? Also yes. He looked at her. Must I answer all of them? She smiled. Only if you want lessons. For perhaps the first time in 20 years, Mateo Falcone obediently filled out paperwork. The first lesson proved considerably less dignified. Sit comfortably. He did. Relax your shoulders. He tried. Wrists softer. He adjusted. Wonderful. She played a simple 5-note exercise. Your turn. Mateo confidently copied it. Every single note was wrong. Children in the neighboring classroom burst out laughing. Mateo frowned. I believe the piano is defective. The piano's been innocent all morning. More laughter. One 6-year-old wandered over holding a sticker chart. You get a star when you practice. Mateo stared down at the glitter-covered sheet. I receive stars. If you're good. The little girl spoke with absolute authority. Mateo accepted the chart. His bodyguards watched, stunned, as America's most feared Mafia boss carefully placed a smiling yellow star beside his own name. The following week, he came back. And the week after that. And then again. Sometimes he claimed he happened to be nearby. Sometimes he brought coffee for the teachers. Sometimes he quietly donated new music stands, insisting they'd been ordered by accident. Amelia pretended not to notice his increasingly creative excuses. She treated him exactly like every other student. When he skipped practice for business meetings, she noticed immediately. Mateo. Yes. You didn't practice. I was occupied. So was everyone else. I negotiated a shipping agreement involving 3 countries. She nodded sympathetically. And somehow your fingers forgot where G major lives. The classroom erupted. Even Mateo laughed, a rare, genuine laugh that surprised everyone, including himself. Soon, another unexpected rivalry developed. Every Friday, the beginners held friendly performance sessions. Participants ranged from retired nurses to nervous accountants, and 6-year-old Lily. Lily never lost. She practiced every single day. When Mateo scored 1 point lower than Lily on rhythm accuracy, he stared at the results sheet. I demand a rematch. Lily folded her tiny arms. You should have practiced. The room exploded with laughter. Even the bodyguards applauded. Mateo narrowed his eyes playfully. I've been defeated by someone who still needs a booster seat. Lily grinned. I also get more stars. She wasn't wrong. Something subtle had begun to shift. Employees at Falcone headquarters noticed it first. Mateo no longer barked impatient orders during meetings. He'd occasionally pause to ask junior staff for their opinions. He even said, thank you. Twice. Victor found the whole transformation deeply unsettling. You're smiling more, he observed one afternoon. Am I? People are noticing. Mateo glanced toward the beginner's music book sitting beside a stack of confidential financial reports. I suppose I am. Victor followed his gaze. A piano teacher is changing you. Mateo answered without a trace of embarrassment. No. She reminds me who I was, before everyone became too afraid to tell me I was wrong. For the first time in years, someone had corrected Mateo Falcone dozens of times in a single afternoon. Wrong notes, wrong posture, wrong timing, wrong hand position. And somehow, he had never enjoyed failing more. Spring arrived quietly, bringing warm afternoons and longer evenings that filled the road's community music center with sunlight instead of winter shadows. The old building had never looked happier. Children practiced duets in one room, while veterans carefully relearned songs they remembered from decades earlier. Elderly couples laughed whenever they lost their place on the page. Every hallway carried the imperfect, beautiful sound of people discovering music at their own pace. Amelia believed those imperfect notes mattered more than any flawless performance, because every wrong note meant somebody had refused to give up. One Tuesday afternoon, she pinned a colorful poster to the community bulletin board, * charity concert for veterans. All proceeds fund free music therapy programs for wounded service members and their families, *. The students gathered around immediately. Will there be cookies? One little boy asked. Amelia laughed. There are always cookies. A retired Marine raised his hand. Can beginners perform? Especially beginners. She smiled warmly. But we'll make mistakes. So will I. The nervous looks around the room slowly melted away. This concert wasn't about perfection. It was about courage. Across town, Mateo sat through another endless board meeting while executives argued over international shipping contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Normally, he'd have settled the dispute in minutes. Instead, his attention kept drifting to the flyer folded inside his notebook, the charity concert. Amelia had casually handed it to every student after class, Mateo included, without any special treatment. If you'd like to come, she'd said. No pressure. No VIP invitation. No reserved seating. Just another student. Victor noticed Mateo staring at the paper. A children's recital? It's a charity concert. Victor looked genuinely confused. You're considering attending? I'm considering helping. Victor hesitated. Publicly? No. That answer surprised him even more. 3 days later, the music center received an anonymous phone call. The woman working the office nearly dropped the receiver. You're donating all of that. She repeated the number twice, just to be sure she'd heard it right. Enough money to rent the city's finest concert hall. Enough to replace every broken instrument. Enough to fund years of therapy scholarships. When Amelia found out about the donation, she immediately asked the obvious question. Who gave it? No name. There must be paperwork. The donor requested complete anonymity. She frowned thoughtfully. I'd like to thank them. I'm afraid they specifically asked that no one try. Amelia smiled anyway. Then I hope they know they've made a great many people very happy. That evening, Mateo received a brief text from the anonymous foundation account he'd used. * donation accepted. Identity remains confidential. * he quietly slipped the phone back into his pocket. One of his bodyguards glanced into the rearview mirror. You look relieved, boss. I am. They'll never know. Mateo looked out the window. They don't need to. The charity concert arrived faster than anyone expected. The historic Emerson Concert Hall filled almost to capacity. Families, veterans, teachers, children, retirees, people from every walk of life sat together beneath the same elegant ceiling. Nobody cared about social status. Only the music mattered. Backstage, Amelia knelt beside 8-year-old Sophie, whose hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold her sheet music. I can't do it. Yes, you can. What if everyone laughs? Amelia gently squeezed her shoulder. They're too busy hoping you'll succeed. Sophie took a deep breath. Really, I've never met an audience that wanted a child to fail. The little girl smiled. You always know what to say. Amelia shook her head. No. I just remember what someone once said to me. Mateo watched everything from the very last row of the auditorium. No reserved balcony. No security surrounding his chair. His bodyguard sat several rows behind him, dressed casually enough that nobody gave them a second look, exactly the way he wanted it. One performance followed another, some polished, some wonderfully imperfect. Every round of applause felt genuine. When a veteran with a prosthetic arm finished a slow arrangement of amazing grace, the audience rose together, without anyone asking them to. Several people quietly wiped away tears. Mateo found himself clapping harder than anyone in the room, not because the performance had been technically flawless, but because of the courage behind it. During intermission, someone approached Amelia backstage. Miss Rhodes. She turned. She blinked in surprise. Maestro Whitmore, I hope you don't mind that I came. Of course not. He smiled warmly. I've conducted orchestras in 23 countries. She laughed nervously. And today you're watching beginner piano students. I've rarely enjoyed an evening more. She looked genuinely touched. I think you're being kind. No. I'm being honest. He glanced toward the stage, where children were getting ready for the second half. Anyone can train professionals. It takes someone extraordinary to convince frightened beginners they're already musicians. Amelia didn't quite know how to respond. Daniel continued. If you ever wish to develop a national music education program, I'd be honored to help. She smiled. Thank you. That means more than you know. Neither of them noticed the pair of eyes watching from across the hallway. Mateo. He wasn't angry, exactly, just unexpectedly uncomfortable. One of his bodyguards leaned in quietly. Boss, you've negotiated ceasefires between rival syndicates. Yes. You look significantly more nervous now. Mateo sighed. I believe I dislike that conductor. The bodyguard raised an eyebrow. Because of his musical opinions? No. He watched Amelia smile at Daniel. The bodyguard fought very hard not to laugh. Unfortunately, someone else had also been watching, Victor Salazar. Unlike Mateo, Victor recognized opportunity instantly. He quietly pulled aside one of his media consultants. Tomorrow morning, I want photographs of Mateo attending the charity concert. But he entered privately. Find them anyway. And the conductor? Perfect. Make sure people believe Amelia is collecting powerful men one after another. The consultant hesitated. That isn't true. Victor's expression hardened. It doesn't have to be. The next morning, the headlines changed again. Mafia boss secretly funds piano teacher's career. International conductor competing for Amelia Rhodes. Political engagement still in doubt. Television commentators began inventing entire narratives. Anonymous insiders claimed Amelia had manipulated powerful men through carefully staged innocence. Others insisted Mateo had abandoned his responsibilities out of infatuation. Social media turned merciless. Amelia stared at her phone in disbelief. I've never even spoken to a reporter. One of the teachers sighed. Sometimes silence becomes someone else's story. Meanwhile, inside Falcone headquarters, several Mafia families demanded that Mateo restore the original engagement, immediately. Old political alliances began showing cracks. Victor stood quietly beside the conference table. The pressure is increasing. I know. The families want certainty. Mateo slowly folded the newspaper, carrying another fabricated headline. They'll get certainty. He believed Mateo had finally surrendered. He had no idea. The certainty Mateo intended to deliver would destroy everything Victor had spent years quietly building. For nearly a week, Amelia tried to ignore the headlines. She stopped checking her phone before breakfast. She turned down every interview request. She even asked the teachers at the music center not to mention the newspapers in front of the kids. If they ask questions, she told them gently, tell them we're preparing for the spring recital. What about the reporters outside? We'll let them get bored. Most eventually did. Not all of them. Every morning, at least one photographer waited across the street, hoping to catch another shot of the woman who'd unknowingly become the center of a mafia scandal. Amelia simply smiled, unlocked the front door, and welcomed her students in. The kids still cared more about finger exercises than gossip, one of the many reasons she loved them. Across the city, Mateo's world had grown considerably less peaceful. Representatives from the syndicate's most powerful families gathered inside the Falcone estate for an emergency council. No reporters, no politicians, only the people whose influence had shaped organized power for decades. The tension in the room was thick before anyone even spoke. An elderly Don finally broke the silence. You embarrassed us. Mateo met his gaze calmly. I embarrassed no one. The engagement collapsed. The engagement never truly existed. Another Don leaned forward. Appearances matter. So does honesty. Murmurs spread around the table. Those two words were rarely spoken together in Mafia politics. Victor Salazar watched carefully. Everything was unfolding exactly as he'd anticipated. The older generation feared instability. Fear made people predictable. Predictable people were easy to manipulate. Victor just needed one final push. 3 evenings later, one of the city's oldest private clubs hosted a charity gala attended by influential business leaders, diplomats, and several prominent Mafia families. Amelia had accepted the invitation only because the event promised substantial donations for community music programs. She wore the same elegant navy blue dress she'd worn the night of the mistaken proposal, not to make a statement, simply because she couldn't justify buying another formal gown. As she stepped into the ballroom, conversations briefly paused. Some guests smiled warmly. Others whispered behind crystal glasses. Amelia pretended not to notice. She'd learned that kindness often required selective hearing. Near the center of the room stood Isabella Morrow, beautiful, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, at least on the surface. Watching Amelia move confidently through the ballroom lit something Isabella had spent months trying to bury. Humiliation. Jealousy. Confusion. When Amelia reached the refreshment table, Isabella intercepted her. What an unexpected surprise. Amelia smiled politely. Good evening. I didn't realize invitations to events like this had become so. Several nearby guests fell silent instantly. She also understood that firing back with anger would only create the spectacle everyone was waiting for. Of course, Isabella glanced around dramatically, and not because powerful men suddenly find teachers fascinating. Soft laughter rose from a few guests. Someone quietly looked away. Amelia took a slow breath, then smiled. I sincerely hope your evening improves. Excuse me. Hurt people often try to share their pain. I'd rather not help with that. Without another word, Amelia picked up her glass of water, nodded politely, and walked away. No argument. No attempt to defend herself. Her quiet dignity left Isabella standing alone under dozens of uncomfortable eyes. Ironically, that silence embarrassed Isabella far more than any sharp comeback ever could have. Unfortunately, Victor had been waiting for exactly this moment. Within minutes, he quietly approached a circle of journalists. I normally wouldn't comment, he said, lowering his voice just enough to hook their curiosity. But Miss Rhodes has become remarkably skilled at attracting influential benefactors. The reporters leaned in. First our chairman. Then an internationally respected conductor. I suppose charity can be very profitable. One journalist frowned. Are you suggesting misconduct? Victor smiled carefully. I'm suggesting nothing. The public can reach its own conclusions. It was the oldest trick in politics. Never make the accusation yourself. Just make sure everyone else does it for you. By the next morning, every major news outlet was running some version of the same story. Did Amelia Rhodes build her reputation through powerful connections? Opinion shows debated her character. Anonymous sources questioned her intentions. Social media grew crueler by the hour. Some parents even called the music center, asking whether they should pull their kids out. One mother showed up in person. She looked embarrassed. I don't believe those stories. Amelia smiled gently. I wanted to hear your answer. Amelia looked toward the practice room, where children were struggling through simple melodies. My answer's in there. The mother followed her gaze. I don't understand. When she finally left, she hugged Amelia goodbye. I'm sorry I doubted you. You didn't. You just asked a fair question. That same afternoon, Matteo received a confidential report from his private intelligence division. Unlike newspaper gossip, this report came with evidence, phone records, encrypted financial transfers, private correspondence, hidden offshore accounts. Every document pointed to one man, Victor Salazar. The engagement to Isabella had never been about stability, it had been about control. Victor needed both families united, because united families rarely questioned the advisor standing between them. Matteo turned another page, then another. The evidence kept mounting. One line caught his eye. Anonymous payments to multiple media consultants responsible for recent attacks against Amelia Rhodes. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with disappointment. He had trusted Victor. The following evening, Matteo summoned every senior leader of the Falcone syndicate. No excuses. No absences. Within the hour, the council chamber was full. Victor walked in confidently, certain the meeting would finally restore the political engagement. Instead, Matteo dropped a thick folder onto the center of the table. Tonight, I will. Victor smiled politely. We're relieved to hear that. Matteo opened the folder. The room went dead silent. One by one, documents flashed onto the screen behind him. Secret bank transfers, forged authorizations, private communications, recorded conversations. Every piece of evidence tied back to Victor. Faces around the table shifted from confusion to disbelief to outrage. Victor stood abruptly. These records have been fabricated. Mateo calmly pressed a button. An audio recording filled the room. Victor's own voice, clear and undeniable, laying out exactly how public opinion could be manipulated to force the engagement forward. The recording ended. Silence stretched for several long seconds. The engagement announced months ago is permanently canceled. No alliance built on deception deserves to survive. He looked straight at Victor. As of this moment, you hold no authority inside the Falcone Syndicate. Security stepped forward. For the first time in decades, Victor Salazar understood exactly what true powerlessness felt like. You destroyed years of political strategy for a piano teacher. Mateo's answer came quiet and even. No. I destroyed it because it was built on lies. The room stayed silent. Not one person argued. Not one person objected. For the first time in years, the most powerful mafia families in the country had witnessed something far rarer than strength. They had witnessed integrity. Victor Salazar's downfall spread through financial circles before the sun had fully risen. The newspapers called it the largest internal collapse in the history of the Falcone Syndicate. Television analysts spent days explaining how one trusted advisor had quietly built an empire of influence beneath the empire everyone could already see. His frozen accounts became public. His shell corporations vanished almost overnight. Political allies who'd once fought for his attention now scrambled to erase every photograph that included him. Power, Amelia would later say, often traveled faster than loyalty. Isabella Moro watched the news alone, inside the library of her family's estate. The engagement portrait had already been taken down from the wall. Only a pale rectangle remained where the frame used to hang. She stared at it for a long time. Months earlier, she'd believed she'd lost Mateo to another woman. Now she understood something far more painful. She had never truly held his heart in the first place. Their engagement had always been an arrangement, a negotiation, a political calculation, not love. Not friendship. Not even genuine companionship. She laughed quietly at herself. So many years spent trying to win a contract. Her mother stepped in softly. You should fight for him. Isabella slowly shook her head. No. For the first time, I think I understand why I already lost. Her mother frowned. Because of that teacher? Isabella looked out toward the garden, where children from a nearby school were laughing beyond the estate walls. No. Because she never tried to win at all. Life at the Rhodes Community Music Center slowly returned to normal. The reporters disappeared. The gossip moved on to other things. The children went back to arguing about stickers instead of headlines. Every Friday afternoon, Amelia held a beginner recital in the small auditorium. Parents squeezed into folding chairs. Grandparents proudly recorded every wrong note. Nobody complained. Imperfection had become part of the celebration. Mateo never missed a single one. Sometimes he arrived early to help move chairs. Sometimes he quietly repaired broken music stands before anyone noticed. Sometimes he simply sat in the back row, clapping louder than anyone else in the building. The children had stopped calling him the scary man. Now, they just called him Mr. Mateo. One afternoon, 6-year-old Lily tugged gently on his jacket. You practiced. I did. I can tell. How? You only missed 2 notes. Mateo smiled. That's progress. She nodded proudly. You finally earned another gold star. He accepted the glitter sticker with complete seriousness. His bodyguards had long since given up pretending this wasn't perfectly normal. Several months passed. Summer faded into autumn. The Community Music Center announced its annual children's recital. Amelia spent weeks preparing every student. No one is trying to impress anyone, she reminded them constantly. We're simply sharing music. The children repeated the phrase until they could say it together, word for word. On the evening of the recital, every seat was filled. Families crowded the aisles. Veterans who'd performed at the charity concert came back to cheer on the new students. Harold sat in his favorite seat in the second row. Even Daniel Whitmore quietly slipped into the audience without announcing himself. None of the tension that had once surrounded Amelia's life remained. Only anticipation. Only kindness. Backstage, a nervous little girl burst into tears moments before her turn. I can't. Yes, you can. My hands won't stop shaking. Amelia knelt beside her. Do you remember what we practiced? Exactly. And if I forget? Amelia smiled. I'll still be proud of you. The child wrapped her tiny arms around Amelia. I love you too. Mateo watched the whole exchange from the wings. No boardroom victory, no international deal, no business triumph had ever moved him the way those 5 simple words did. He finally understood why people followed Amelia so naturally. She made everyone standing near her feel seen. The recital unfolded beautifully. Children stumbled through melodies. Parents applauded enthusiastically. One elderly beginner accidentally bowed before he'd even sat down at the piano, and the audience laughed affectionately. Amelia closed the evening with a quiet duet alongside several of her youngest students. The final note lingered beneath the auditorium ceiling. Then came thunderous applause. Children ran into their parents' arms. Teachers congratulated one another. The evening should have ended right there. Instead, the stage lights stayed on. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Mateo stepped onto the stage. No security surrounded him. No politicians walked beside him. No mafia leaders waited nearby. Just one man in a simple navy suit. In his hand rested a small velvet box. Amelia recognized it instantly. The same box. The same ring. He walked toward her slowly, not with the confidence of a man who once commanded entire rooms, but with the nervousness of someone who finally understood that love could never be ordered into place. The audience fell completely silent. Mateo smiled, a genuinely embarrassed smile. Last time, I asked the wrong woman. Soft laughter echoed through the hall. Even Amelia couldn't help laughing. Mateo took another careful step. I've replayed that evening more times than I'd like to admit. I kept wondering why it became the happiest mistake of my life. He looked directly into her eyes. I was wrong. It was because you treated me like everyone else. The room stayed perfectly still. You corrected my mistakes. You celebrated my progress. You never cared about my reputation. You only cared whether I practiced. The audience laughed warmly. Then he opened the velvet box. I'd like to correct one final mistake. Very slowly, Mateo lowered himself onto one knee. Not because tradition demanded it. Not because cameras were waiting. Not because anyone expected it of him, but because respect deserved humility. His voice softened. Amelia Rhodes. I know exactly whose hand I want to hold for the rest of my life. I know exactly whose laughter I want to hear after every hard day. And I know exactly whose kindness taught me that the strongest people never conquer hearts. They earn them. He took a quiet breath. Will you marry me? The entire auditorium seemed to stop breathing. Amelia stared at him for several long seconds. Tears shimmered in her eyes. So, she whispered, this time, you're absolutely certain. Mateo smiled. I've never been more certain of anything. She laughed through her tears. Good, because I'd hate to return it twice. The audience erupted before she'd even finished speaking. Amelia gently offered her hand. Mateo carefully slid the ring onto her finger. The applause seemed endless. Children cheered. Parents stood. Veterans wiped away tears. Even Daniel Whitmore smiled as he joined the standing ovation. For the first time in many years, the most feared mafia boss in America looked less like a legend, and more like the happiest student who had finally learned the one lesson he needed most. 1 year later, few people still talked about the engagement that had shaken America's mafia world. Not because they'd forgotten it, but because something far more remarkable had quietly taken its place. On a peaceful Saturday morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the newly opened Rhodes Music Foundation. The building wasn't extravagant. No marble staircases, no golden chandeliers, no armed security at the door. Instead, children hurried through the entrance carrying worn violin cases. Veterans greeted each other over fresh coffee. Families who'd never been able to afford music lessons now filled every classroom with hope. A simple plaque beside the entrance read, "Every heart deserves a song." Inside, laughter echoed down every hallway. The foundation offered free music education to children, seniors, veterans recovering from trauma, and families rebuilding their lives after hardship. Every piano was occupied. Every guitar had found eager hands. Every classroom carried the beautiful sound of people discovering that it's never too late to begin. Amelia walked from room to room, exactly as she always had. She congratulated a shy teenager who'd finally mastered his first sonata. She helped an elderly widow find her confidence after missing the same measure 5 times in a row. She tied the shoelaces of a little boy who insisted he could play faster than he could walk. Success hadn't changed a thing about her. If anything, she smiled even more. Across the hallway, the most feared Mafia boss in America balanced 6 folding chairs on one shoulder while carrying a box of children's music books on the other. Mr. Matteo, a chorus of young voices called out at once. We need help. He set everything down immediately. What happened? Our drums too loud. Our violins too quiet. And Jacob says counting to 4 is impossible. Jacob crossed his arms. It goes too fast. Matteo nodded thoughtfully. I agree. Jacob looked relieved. No. The children laughed. So did you ever get better? He smiled. My teacher was very patient. Across the room, Amelia overheard the whole thing. The children burst into delighted laughter. Matteo placed one hand dramatically over his heart. I thought marriage came with professional confidentiality. She grinned. But bad rhythm remains everyone's business. Even the parents laughed. Every Saturday followed roughly the same pattern. He carried instruments between rooms. He patiently sat through beginners playing the same simple exercises over and over again. He never once complained. In fact, he applauded every tiny improvement like it was a milestone. One afternoon, a nervous 8-year-old froze halfway through a performance. I ruined it. Matteo quietly walked onto the small stage and knelt beside her. May I tell you a secret? She nodded. The first piano lesson I ever took, I played every single note wrong. She blinked. Really? Everyone. Everyone. What did your teacher do? He smiled toward Amelia. She asked me to come back next week. The little girl looked back at the piano. Then maybe I can try again. I was hoping you'd say that. She began once more, and this time, she reached the final note. Later that afternoon, while volunteers cleaned up classrooms and children chased each other through the courtyard, a young journalist approached Matteo. Matteo smiled politely. I've answered harder once. The reporter hesitated. A year ago, you canceled what many called the most powerful political engagement in Mafia history. Some people still say it cost you influence. Do you ever regret your decision? Matteo glanced through the open classroom door. Inside, Amelia knelt beside a frightened little girl, patiently guiding tiny fingers across the piano keys, celebrating every correct note as if it were a standing ovation at Carnegie Hall. Amelia clapped first. The whole classroom followed. Matteo watched quietly before answering. No empire, he said softly, ever applauded me the way she did, the first time I finally learned to listen. The journalist lowered his notebook. There was nothing left worth asking. Near the entrance of the foundation hung 2 framed photographs. The first captured that unforgettable evening when Amelia calmly returned an engagement ring in front of hundreds of stunned guests. The second showed 2 smiling people standing on a small recital stage, surrounded by children, moments after she'd accepted that very same ring. Between the 2 photographs rested a modest wooden plaque. Asterisk, the first proposal was made by accident. The second was made with certainty. Only one became the beginning of forever. Asterisk. Visitors often paused to read it. Many smiled. Some quietly wiped away tears. Children usually asked why there were 2 pictures. Amelia always gave the same answer. Because life sometimes gives us 2 chances. One to make a mistake, and another to make the right choice. As the afternoon sun settled across the playground outside, music drifted from every classroom. Beginners stumbled through their scales. Veterans practiced old melodies with renewed confidence. Parents applauded children who'd proudly managed only 3 correct notes. No performance was ever too small to celebrate. Amelia reached for Matteo's hand as they stood together in the doorway. He squeezed it gently. For decades, he believed the greatest victories were won through power, negotiation, and flawless strategy. He had been wrong. The greatest victory of his life had begun with a misunderstanding, grown through patience, and ended with a woman who had once laughed, returned his ring, and unknowingly taught him that the strongest hearts are never conquered. They are earned. One kind note. One honest choice. One act of quiet love at a time.